Dealings with the Dead, number 78. I know not why, but the idea of another meeting with Martin Smith, notwithstanding my affectionate respect for that good old man, disturbed me so much that I resolved to be out of his way by keeping awake. But, in defiance of my very best efforts, strengthened by a bowl of unsugared hyson at 11:30, if I err not, I fell into a profound slumber, and, at the very appointed moment, found myself at the chapel door. At the third knock, it opened with an almost alarming suddenness. I quietly entered, and the old man closed it softly after me. In 10 minutes, said he, the congregation will assemble. What? I inquired. At this time of night? Be silent, said he, rather angrily, as I thought, and drawing me by the arm to the north side of the door, he shoved me against the vassal monument with a force that I would not have believed it possible for any modern ghost to exert. Be still and listen, said he. In 1782, my dear old pastor, Dr. Freeman, came here as reader and became rector in 1787. Dr. Canner was inducted in 1747 and continued rector 29 years for as I told you, he went off with the plate in 1776. There were no rectors between those two. Brockwell and Troutbeck were Canner's assistants only. The first died in 1755, and the last left the year before Dr. Canner. Well, continued the old man, never reveal what I am about to tell you, Abner. Why, Charlie, the Trinitarians have never surrendered their claims upon this church, and precisely at midnight upon every Sabbath since 1776, Dr. Canner and the congregation have gathered here, and the church service has been performed just as it used to be before the Revolution. They make short work of it, rarely exceeding 15 minutes. Hush for your life, they are coming. A glare unearthly light, invisible through the windows, as Martin assured me, to all without, filled the tabernacle in an instant, exceedingly like gaslight, and at the same instant I heard a rattling resembling the down-sitting after prayers in a village meeting-house, where the seats are clappers and go on hinges. Observing that my jaws chattered, Martin pressed my hand in his icy fingers and whispered that it was nothing but Dr. Canner's congregation coming up, rather less silently, of course, than when they were in the flesh. Being the first Sunday in the month, all the communion plate that Canner carried off was paraded on the altar. I wish the 12 apostles could have seen it. It glittered like Jones' ball and Poor's bow window, viewed from the old Donison corner. The whole interior of the chapel was marvelously changed. I was much struck by a showy gilt crown over the organ, supported by a couple of gilt mitres. This was the famous organ said to have been selected by Handel, which came over in 1756. At this moment, a brief and sudden darkness hid everything from view, succeeded instantly by a brighter light than before, and all was changed. The organ had vanished. The monuments of Shirley and Apthorpe and the tablet of Price over the vestry door were gone. I looked behind me for the vassal monument against which I had been leaning. It was no longer there. Martin Smith perceived my astonishment and whispered that Dr. Canner was never so partial to the stone chapel, which was opened in 1754, as he was to the ancient King's Chapel in which he had been inducted in 1747, and in which we then were. The pews were larger than any Hingham boxes I ever saw, but very small. The pulpit was on the north side. In front of it was the governor's pew, highly ornamented, lined with China silk. The cushions and chairs there were covered with crimson damask, and the window curtain was of the same material. Near to this, I saw an elevated pew in which were half a dozen fine-looking skeletons, with their heads up and their arms akimbo. This pew, Martin informed me, was reserved for the officers of the Army and Navy. A small organ was in the western gallery, said to be the first ever heard in our country. From the walls and pillars hung several escutcheons and memorial bearings. I distinguished those of the royal family and of Andros, Nicholson, Hamilton, Dudley, Shute, Belcher, and Shirley. I had always associated the hourglass with my ideas of a Presbyterian pulpit. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, that dude was Presbyterian, by the way. In the olden time, when the very length of the discourse gave the hearer some little foretaste of eternity, I was rather surprised to see an hourglass of larger proportions perched upon the pulpit in its highly ornamented stand of brass. The altarpiece was at the easterly end of the church, with the glory, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and some texts of Scripture. The congregation had taken their seats, and a slender, sickly-looking skeleton glided into the reading desk. "Dr. Canner," said I. "Brockwell, the assistant," replied Martin in a whisper. "The very first wardens of 1686 are in the pew tonight. Bullivant and Banks, they all serve in rotation. Next Sabbath we shall have Foxcroft and Ravenscroft. Clerkhill and Rutley are sextons tonight." The services were very well conducted, and taking all things into consideration, I was surprised that I had comprehended so well as I did. The prayer for the royal family was very impressively delivered. The assistant made use, I observed, of the Athanasian Creed, and everyone seemed to understand it, at which I was greatly surprised. Dr. Canner seemed very feeble, and preached a very short discourse upon the loss of Esau's birthright, making a pointed application to the conversion of King's Chapel by the Unitarians. He made rather a poor case of it, I thought. Martin was so much offended that he said, though being a ghost, he was obliged to be quiet. He wished I would call the watch and break up the meeting. I told him that I did not believe Dr. Canner's arguments would have any very mischievous effect, and it seemed not more than fair that these ancient worshippers should have the use of the church at midnight, so long as they conducted themselves orderly, consumed no fuel, and furnished their own light. One of the sextons, passing near me, accidentally dropped a small parcel. I was seized with a vehement desire of possessing it, and watching my opportunity, conveyed it to my pocket. When Dr. Canner pronounced his final amen, light was instantly turned into darkness. A silent noise ensued. "The service is over," said Martin, and all was still. I begged Martin to light his lamp, and by its light I examined the parcel the sexton had dropped. It was a small roll containing some extracts from the records. They were not without interest. September 21st, 1691. It must not be forgot that Sir Robert Robertson gave a new silk damask cushion and cloth pulpit cover. 1697. Whit Sunday, paid Mr. Conibal for buying and carting poses and hanging the Doras 8. December 20th, paid for a stone. Gug Clark Hill broke. March 29th, 1698, paid Mr. Shulson for looking after the boys, £1. 1701, August 4th, paid for scouring the brass frame for the hourglass, 10s. 1733, October 11th, voted that the brass stand for the hourglass be lent to the church of Scituate, as also 3 diaper napkins provided by Mr. Addington Davenport, their minister, gives his note to return the same to the church wardens of the church, and so on. April 3rd, 1740, Brecht of Mr. Sylvester Gardner, £16, 2 shills in full for wine for the chapel for the year past, John Hancock. And technically, the use of alcoholic beverages in church services makes it sorcery. I was about to put this fragment of the record into my pocket. If, said Martin, you did not particularly covet a visit from Clark Hill, or whichever of the old sextons it was that dropped that paper, leave it as you found it. I did so most joyfully. If you have any questions to ask of me, said the old man, ask them now and briefly, for we are about to part, to meet no more until we meet, as I trust we shall, in a better world. And is the implication that they have all not passed on, both the people, the church service and, Martin. As a mere matter of curiosity, said I should like to know if you consider your venerable pastor, now dead and gone, Dr. Freeman, as the successor of St. Peter. No more, said Martin Smith, with an expression almost too comical for a ghost, that I consider you myself successors of the Sexton, who under the directions of Abraham buried Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre. Do you consider the apostolical succession broken off at the time of Dr. Freeman's ordination? Short off like a pipe stem, he replied. And so, you do not consider the laying on of a bishop hand necessary to empower a man to preach the gospel? No more, said he, than I consider the laying on of spades necessary to empower a man to dig a grave. We were a peculiar people, but quite as zealous for good works as any of our neighbors. The Bishop of New York declined to ordain our pastor, because we were Unitarians, and we could not expect the service from our neighbors. Had it been otherwise, on account of our adherence to the liturgy, though modified and to certain episcopal forms, so we ordained him ourselves. The senior warden laid his hands upon the good man and true, said nothing of the 39 articles, but gave him a Bible as the sole compass for his voyage, in full confidence that, while he steered thereby, we should be upon our course to the haven where we would be. We have never felt the want of the succession for a moment, and ever since we have been the most happy. And you... Just then a distant steam whistle struck upon the ear, which Martin undoubtedly mistook for cock crowing, for his lamp was extinguished in an instant, and he vanished. If my confidence in dreams needed any confirmation, nothing more could be required than a careful comparison of many of these incidents with the statements in the history of King's Chapel, published by the late amiable rector 17 years ago. A copy is, at this moment, beneath my eye, and upon this flyleaf, in the author's own handwriting, under the date January 1st, 1843, I read, presented to Martin Smith for many years, a sexton of this church, from his friend F.W.P. Greenwood. Every one was the friend of good old Martin Smith. Here, deposited among the leaves of this book, is an order from that excellent man, my honored friend, Colonel Joseph May, and Junior Warden. It bears date Saturday, 18th June, 1814. It is laconic, or is it laconic, and to the point, toll slow. This is also subscribed, your friend. Yes, everyone was the friend of Martin Smith. He was a spruce little old man, especially at Christmas. And perhaps the grave, as you could say, as it is, if there's attachments that you have in this life, and I don't just mean attachments to worship, because you sort of should have attachments to some sort of expression of what you believe is good and true and all that sort of stuff, but, you know, more political, because politics is supposed to be a tool, and politics is just, citizenship, or, you know what I mean, they were attached to their sectarian thing, and Martin was attached to, his reputation. But of course, it's all going through the mind of Abner, like Charley, and a reduction of activity in the temporal parietal lobe can cause what people consider to be the interactions with the dead.